The Man in the Mirror. The city skyline shimmered under the weight of a crimson sunset, its golden rays casting long shadows over towering glass buildings. Inside one of the tallest, Chase Donovan Carter stood before a vast window in his penthouse office, adjusting the cuffs of his crisp white shirt. His reflection stared back at him, a man of precision, power, and control. Everything in his life was perfectly structured, from the billion-dollar deals he closed daily to the temperature of his morning espresso. Carter Enterprises, a global financial and real estate empire, was built on ruthless efficiency, just as his late father had trained him to be. "Your schedule for tomorrow, sir." Emily Clarkson, his assistant of 7 years, handed him a sleek black folder. Chase barely glanced at her. "Anything urgent?" "The Singapore merger is still pending final signatures, but the legal team assures me it will be finalized by the weekend," Emily replied. "And your board dinner has been moved to 8. Chase nodded. The conversation was mechanical, like everything else in his life. His wealth had secured him power beyond imagination, but it had also stripped him of something fundamental: connection. As the evening descended over the city, Chase prepared to leave, his driver Marcus already waiting in the sleek black Rolls-Royce below. He moved through the halls of Carter Enterprises with the air of a man untouchable, indifferent to the weary goodnights of employees who saw him as a machine rather than a man. But fate had other plans that night. The encounter. The storm came without warning. By the time Chase left his building, rain pounded the streets in relentless sheets, drenching the sidewalks and blurring the city lights into watery smears. He barely paid it any mind as he slid into the back seat of his car. "Straight home, Marcus," he instructed, scrolling through stock reports on his phone. The car moved through the city, the rhythm of raindrops against the windows a steady percussion. But as they turned onto a quieter street near the financial district, something caught Chase's eye. A flash of movement outside a rundown convenience store. 2 figures huddled together under the awning, soaked to the bone. Chase would have ignored them like he had ignored 1,000 others, but something made him glance up again, and that's when his entire world tilted. The girls, twins, no older than 12, had faces that made Chase's breath catch in his throat. They looked just like him. Identical features, the same sharp cheekbones, the same piercing gray-blue eyes he saw in the mirror every morning. His pulse thundered in his ears. "Sir?" Marcus asked, sensing his tension. Chase hesitated. Every rational instinct told him to keep driving. He had meetings, obligations. He had a carefully crafted world that had no space for entanglements. But then the girls lifted their heads, staring directly at him. Their expressions were unreadable, but in their eyes, he saw something he couldn't ignore. Recognition. And then one of them whispered a single word. "Daddy?" A shattered illusion. Chase felt as if the air had been sucked out of the car. His grip tightened on his phone, but his fingers trembled. No, this was impossible. A trick of the mind. A cruel coincidence. Yet he found himself whispering, "Stop the car." Marcus hesitated but obeyed, pulling over just past the store. Chase sat motionless for a moment, battling the war inside him. This is absurd. Keep driving. And yet, against every logical thought in his head, he opened the door and stepped into the storm. The rain was ice against his skin, soaking through his tailored suit in seconds. He barely noticed. He was moving on autopilot, his steps slow, measured, as if approaching a dream. The twins didn't run. Instead, they stared at him, wide-eyed, hesitant but defiant. Chase had built his entire career reading people, analyzing motives, deciphering lies. These girls weren't lying. Something deep in his chest twisted painfully. "Who are you?" His voice was rougher than intended. The braver of the two, the one on the left, stepped forward, her chin lifted in a silent challenge. "We're not lying," she said, her voice stronger than he expected. "We know who you are." The second girl, slightly smaller, clutched a worn backpack against her chest. Mom told us about you before She trailed off, looking away. Chase's mouth went dry. Before she what? The first girl, the bold one, dug into the backpack and pulled out a tarnished silver locket. She hesitated for only a second before flipping it open. Inside was a photograph, worn and faded, but still unmistakable. Sarah. Chase felt as if the ground beneath him had crumbled. Sarah Mitchell, the woman he had loved once. The woman who had disappeared from his life without a trace 12 years ago. The woman he had tried to find, only to be told by his father's attorneys that she wanted nothing to do with him. The woman who, apparently, had given birth to his children. His knees felt weak. His carefully controlled life was unraveling in real time. Where is she? His voice barely rose above the rain. The twins exchanged glances before the quiet one whispered, "She's gone." A cold, sinking dread settled in Chase's stomach. "Gone," he repeated. "She got sick," the first girl said bluntly. Her voice didn't waver, but Chase could see the pain behind her eyes. Really sick. And then one day, she didn't wake up. The rain blurred his vision. Or maybe it wasn't the rain. Chase opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Because in that moment, standing there in the pouring rain, staring at two homeless girls who carried his face, he realized something that shook him to his core. His father had lied to him. And that lie had stolen 12 years from him. 12 years from them. The weight of the past. The city never slept, but Chase Donovan Carter felt as though the world had gone eerily silent. He sat in the back of his sleek Rolls-Royce, his Italian leather shoes soaked from the rain, his tailored suit clinging uncomfortably to his skin. But he barely noticed. The twins, his daughters, sat across from him, huddled together in the warmth of the car. Their clothes were still damp, their backpacks clutched tightly in their laps as if they expected to be thrown out at any moment. Neither of them spoke, neither did Chase. He had spent a lifetime controlling every detail of his world. But now, his world had tilted on its axis, and for the first time in years, he had no idea what to do. Sarah was gone. She had been sick. She had died. And all this time, he had been told that she had walked away willingly, that she had wanted nothing to do with him. A lie. A calculated, deliberate lie. Chase inhaled sharply, his fingers clenching against his knees. Whoever had kept this truth from him, whoever had stolen 12 years from him and these girls, was going to pay. But first, he had to face the present. He turned to the twins, his voice careful, measured. "What are your names?" The bolder twin, who had been the first to speak earlier, stared at him warily. "I'm Rose," she said, her voice sharp and defensive. "And this is Lisa." Lisa barely nodded. She kept her gaze low, staring at the locket still clutched in her small fingers. They didn't trust him. Why would they? To them, he was a stranger, a rich man in a fancy car who had just now decided to acknowledge their existence. And maybe he deserved their distrust. He swallowed past the lump in his throat. "How long have you been on your own?" Rose's jaw tightened. A year. A year. A full year where his daughters had been sleeping in alleyways, digging through dumpsters for food, trying to survive in a world that had abandoned them. Chase exhaled slowly, trying to keep his anger in check. Anger at himself, at his father, at whoever had failed to protect them. "Do you have anywhere to stay?" Rose hesitated for a fraction of a second before shaking her head. "We had a place, but the shelter kicked us out 2 weeks ago. They were overcrowded." Lisa shifted uncomfortably, pressing her small frame closer to her sister. Chase's stomach twisted. He had more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. He had a penthouse with rooms that had never been used, furniture that had never been touched. And his daughters, his flesh and blood, had been sleeping on the streets. His voice came out softer than he expected. "Come with me. Just for tonight. You can eat, shower, and sleep in a warm bed." Lisa's head snapped up, her wide blue-gray eyes filled with uncertainty. But Rose narrowed her gaze. Why? Chase blinked. What do you mean? Why now? Rose's voice was sharper, angrier. Where were you when Mom was sick? When we were alone? When we had to beg just to survive? The accusation cut deeper than Chase wanted to admit. I didn't know, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Rose clenched her jaw. Would it have mattered if you did? Chase couldn't answer that. He wanted to believe that he would have fought for them, that he would have turned his world upside down to be there for them. But the truth was, he had spent 12 years believing Sarah had abandoned him. Would he have fought for someone who, in his mind, had already walked away? The silence stretched between them, thick with tension. Lisa shifted again, glancing up at her sister. Rose, she murmured. I'm hungry. That was all it took. Rose's expression hardened, but she sighed, shoulders dropping slightly. Fine, she muttered. One night. Chase felt something loosen in his chest. Thank you. But Rose turned away, her eyes locked on the rain-streaked window. Don't thank me, she said, her voice flat. This doesn't mean we trust you. Chase didn't argue. He had a long road ahead of him. The penthouse. The drive was silent. When they arrived at Chase's penthouse, the twins hesitated at the entrance. Lisa gawked at the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that stretched across the living space, revealing the entire city below. Rose, however, kept her guard up, her arms crossed as she scanned the room as if searching for a trap. Chase gestured toward the hallway. There are guest rooms down there. Each has a bathroom. You can take a shower, and I'll find something for you to wear. Lisa hesitated. We don't have. I'll take care of it, Chase interrupted gently. There are clean towels inside. The girls exchanged glances. Finally, Lisa nodded and followed her sister down the hall. As soon as they disappeared, Chase exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. His entire body felt heavy, weighed down by the storm of emotions crashing through him. 12 years. 12 years of believing Sarah had left by choice. Who had told him that lie? His father. The lawyers? Someone had known. Someone had kept the truth from him. And now he needed answers. He pulled out his phone and dialed the only person who could get them for him. Marcus, he said as soon as the line connected, I need you to dig into everything about Sarah Mitchell. Every record, every trace. I want to know what happened to her, who was in contact with her, who knew about the girls. His driver and personal security expert hesitated. Are you sure you want to go down this road, sir? Chase's grip tightened around his phone. Find out who lied to me, he said, his voice dangerously low. And when you do, call me immediately. As he ended the call, he glanced toward the hallway where his daughters were. Lisa and Rose didn't trust him. They had every reason not to, but he was going to change that, even if it meant dismantling everything he had ever known. The unraveling lies. The quiet hum of the city at night did little to settle Chase Donovan Carter's mind. He stood in the dim glow of his penthouse living room, staring out at the skyline, his hands shoved into his pockets. A glass of untouched whiskey sat on the marble countertop behind him. His mind, however, was nowhere near the luxurious setting. It was in the past. The 12 missing years, the lost time, and the 2 little girls asleep in the guest bedrooms down the hall, his daughters. He turned at the sound of soft footsteps behind him. Emily Clarkson, his assistant, stepped inside, her expression unreadable. You called me over late, she said, setting down her purse on the kitchen counter. That means either a crisis or something personal. And you don't do personal. Chase exhaled sharply. I need you to find out everything about Sarah Mitchell. Where she went, who she spoke to, who kept her from me. Emily crossed her arms. That's a dangerous road, Chase. I don't care. His voice was steel. Someone stole 12 years from me, Emily. I intend to find out who and why. Emily sighed, rubbing her temples. I assume this has something to do with the twins you smuggled past your security team. His jaw tightened. They're mine. Emily's eyebrows lifted, But she didn't look surprised. I figured. You're the best researcher I know, Chase continued. I need you to dig deep. Don't trust surface-level answers. Find me the truth. Emily studied him for a moment before nodding. I'll start immediately. But Chase, she hesitated. Be prepared. You might not like what you find. Chase's fingers curled into a fist at his side. I already don't. The morning after, Chase was up early, moving through his morning routine like a machine. Coffee, emails, a quick workout in his private gym. But today, something was different. For the first time in years, he wasn't alone. He paused outside the guest bedroom doors, hesitating before knocking lightly. Silence. He knocked again. Girls? Still nothing. Chase frowned before pushing the door open. His chest tightened when he saw the empty bed, the blankets pushed aside in a tangle. Panic surged through him as he moved to the next room. Also empty. His heartbeat slammed against his ribs. No, they wouldn't have just left. Would they? Then he heard it, the sound of hushed voices from the kitchen. He exhaled sharply before making his way down the hall. The sight that greeted him stopped him in his tracks. Rose and Lisa sat at the kitchen island, legs swinging from the stools, while his housekeeper, Mrs. Martinez, bustled around them, setting down plates of fresh eggs and toast. The girls were clean, their damp hair brushed and untangled, dressed in oversized t-shirts that likely belonged to him. But what struck him the most was the way they looked. Almost normal. Lisa hesitated before picking up a fork, glancing at her sister for approval. Rose, as expected, was watching everything with suspicion. Mrs. Martinez spotted Chase and smiled. I found them wandering around the hallways this morning. They didn't know if they were allowed to eat. Chase clenched his jaw. You don't have to ask, he said, looking at the girls. If you're hungry, you eat. Lisa's cheeks turned pink, but she nodded. Rose, however, crossed her arms. Not used to being offered food, she muttered. Chase inhaled sharply. I want to change that. She said nothing, turning her attention back to her plate. It wasn't much, but it was something. Secrets in the dark. That afternoon, Emily called. Chase, her voice was hushed, urgent. You were right. Someone went to great lengths to erase Sarah Mitchell's past. Chase straightened in his chair. What did you find? Not much. And that's the problem, Emily admitted. There are gaps in her records, hospital visits that were never logged, missing employment history, even a disappearance report that was never followed up on. Chase's grip on his phone tightened. Someone made sure no one could trace her movements. Exactly, Emily said. But I did find something. A name that kept coming up in old legal documents related to Carter Enterprises. Chase's entire body went still. His company. His father. Who? Emily hesitated before speaking. Gregory Mills. Chase's breath left him like a punch to the gut. Gregory Mills. His father's former right-hand man. The man who had controlled much of the company's overseas operations before Chase took over. The man Chase had fired years ago for suspected corruption. Chase, Emily said cautiously, I think your father did more than just keep Sarah away. I think he orchestrated her disappearance. Chase shut his eyes, rage and regret battling inside him. If his father had lied about this, what else had he lied about? The first crack in the wall. That evening, as Chase sat in his study, staring blankly at the whiskey glass in his hands, he heard soft footsteps behind him. Can we talk? He turned to see Lisa standing in the doorway, shifting nervously. Chase immediately set his drink down. Of course. Come in. Lisa hesitated before stepping inside, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her oversized shirt. You really didn't know about us? She asked quietly. Chase exhaled. No. Lisa swallowed hard. Mom always said you would have come for us if you had known. But Rose thinks. She trailed off. Chase finished for her. Rose thinks I wouldn't have cared. Lisa nodded, eyes downcast. Chase leaned forward. "Lisa," he said, his voice softer than he thought possible. "If I had known, I would have moved mountains to find you." She looked up then, her blue-gray eyes shimmering. "Really? Really?" For the first time, Lisa gave him the tiniest of smiles. "I believe you." Chase's chest tightened. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was the first crack in the wall. The coming storm. Late that night, as Chase lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his phone buzzed on the nightstand. A single message from Emily. "We have a problem. I just found proof that Sarah tried to contact you 12 years ago. Your father intercepted everything. He kept her from you, on purpose." Chase's entire body went cold. A second message came in seconds later. "And there's more. I think she didn't just disappear. I think she was threatened, and I think Gregory Mills is still watching." Chase sat up, his heart pounding. If Mills was still out there, then neither he nor the twins were safe, and he was going to find out why. Shadows of the past. The city pulsed with restless energy beneath the midnight sky, but Chase Donovan Carter wasn't admiring the view. He was seated in his study, fingers clenched around his phone as he reread Emily's messages. His father had intercepted Sarah's attempts to reach him. Gregory Mills had likely been the one pulling the strings. And now, Mills was still out there, watching. Chase had spent years trusting that his father had made the right decisions, that his brutal business tactics were simply the price of success. But now, every carefully constructed piece of his world felt like it was built on lies. Someone had stolen 12 years from him. Someone had stolen Sarah's life. And Chase was done being passive. He needed answers. He needed the truth. And he knew exactly where to start. The confrontation. The black luxury sedan rolled through the quiet outskirts of the city, stopping in front of a massive estate. It wasn't as grand as the Carter family's holdings, but it reeked of power. Gregory Mills still had influence. Even after Chase had forced him out of Carter Enterprises, the man had found ways to stay relevant. And if he was still watching Chase, that meant he still had something to protect. Chase stepped out of the car, ignoring Marcus's concerned glance from the driver's seat. "Stay close, but don't interfere unless necessary." Marcus gave a tight nod. Chase strode toward the house, his rage barely leashed. The front doors swung open before he could knock. Gregory Mills stood there, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, and smirking. "Chase Carter," Mills said smoothly, stepping aside. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Chase didn't bother with small talk. "You lied to me." Mills chuckled, walking toward a polished liquor cabinet and pouring himself a drink. "I lie to a lot of people. You'll have to be more specific." Chase clenched his fists. "Sarah Mitchell. You kept her away from me. You intercepted her letters. You let me believe she left by choice." Mills swirled the amber liquid in his glass, unbothered. "Ah, so you finally figured it out. Took you long enough." Chase's vision went red. He lunged forward, grabbing Mills by the collar and slamming him against the wall. The older man barely flinched. "Still have that famous Carter temper, I see." "You had no right," Chase snarled, shoving him back. "No right to take those years from me. From my daughters." Mills adjusted his suit, unshaken. "Your father made sure you'd never see those letters, Chase. He decided that a woman like Sarah didn't fit into your future." Chase's breathing was ragged. "And you just followed orders." Mills smirked. "I created the orders." Chase's stomach dropped. Mills leaned in. "You think your father orchestrated everything. He was a businessman, a ruthless one, but still just a businessman. I was the one who handled the messes. I was the one who made Sarah disappear." The words sent ice through Chase's veins. "What did you do to her?" His voice was dangerously low. Mills chuckled, sipping his drink. "Relax, Carter. I didn't kill her, but she was persistent, you know. Kept trying to reach you, kept trying to make you aware of those little brats she was carrying. I had to. Persuade her otherwise. Chase's hands trembled. You threatened her. Mills gave him a slow, cold smile. She was given a choice. Leave, or make you her enemy. She chose wisely. Chase felt something crack inside him. You ruined her life. Mills shrugged. She was nothing. Just a girl who would have been a distraction. His expression darkened. And if you're smart, you'll forget all of this. Move on. You have a company to protect. You have an empire to rebuild. Chase's rage turned ice cold. You think I care about the company? He asked, his voice like steel. Mills finally frowned. You should. Chase stepped closer, his presence towering over the older man. I'm going to tear down everything you built, Chase whispered, his voice deadly. Every shady deal. Every offshore account. Every criminal you've ever worked with. And when I'm done, you'll have nothing left. For the first time, Mills looked uneasy. Careful, Carter, he warned. You don't know what you're getting yourself into. Chase smiled, but there was no humor in it. Neither do you. Then he turned and walked away, leaving Mills standing in his own shadow, fortifying the family. By the time Chase returned to the penthouse, his mind was a storm of strategy. He found Emily in his office, waiting. She took one look at his face and sighed. You confronted him, didn't you? He admitted everything. Chase paced. He threatened Sarah, forced her to leave. He made sure I never knew about the twins, and he thinks I'll let him get away with it. Emily exhaled. I assume we're going after him. Not just him, Chase said. Everyone connected to him. I want financial audits on every shell company. I want every past deal dissected. I want to rip apart everything he's done and expose him to the world. Emily smirked. Now you're speaking my language. But before they could continue, the office door cracked open slightly. A pair of small figures stood hesitantly in the doorway. Rose and Lisa. Lisa clutched her locket, while Rose's expression was unreadable. Chase immediately softened. What's wrong? Lisa bit her lip before whispering, Are we safe here? Chase's heart clenched. They had spent so long being afraid alone. You're safe, he said firmly. I promise you. Rose didn't look convinced. Mills won't stop, will he? Chase exhaled, kneeling so he was at their level. No, he admitted, but I won't stop either. Rose's eyes searched his face. You're really gonna fight for us? Chase felt something shift in his chest. With everything I have, he whispered. Rose hesitated before nodding. Lisa looked up at him, then did something that nearly made his heart stop. She stepped forward and hugged him. Chase froze for half a second before wrapping his arms around her gently. It was the first real sign of trust. Emily watched with a small smile. As Lisa pulled away, Rose cleared her throat, shifting awkwardly. Fine. But if we're staying, we want pancakes for breakfast. Chase chuckled, relief washing through him. Pancakes it is. Lisa brightened, with strawberries. And chocolate chips, Rose added quickly. Chase shook his head with amusement. Demanding already. Rose smirked. You better get used to it. For the first time, Chase didn't feel alone. His family was here, and he would do anything to protect them, even if it meant bringing down an empire. The war begins. The next morning, Chase Carter was already awake before the city stirred. The air in the penthouse was unusually still, but inside him, a storm raged. He had spent most of the night strategizing, planning his next moves against Gregory Mills. But one thing had become clear. This was not going to be a clean battle. Mills wouldn't go down quietly, and that meant Chase needed to be ahead of him at every turn. As he sat at his desk, flipping through files Emily had compiled overnight, his phone buzzed. A single text from an unknown number. Back off, or you won't have a family left to protect. Chase's blood turned to ice. Mills wasn't just trying to protect his own empire. He was making this personal. Chase immediately stood, his pulse pounding as he stormed into the security control room he had installed a year ago. His head of security, Jackson, looked up from a row of monitors. "Boss," Jackson greeted, straightening at the tension in Chase's stance. "We're upgrading security," Chase snapped. "I want double shifts. No one gets in or out of this building without my authorization. And I want surveillance on Mills. I want to know what he eats for breakfast before he even orders it." Jackson nodded, his jaw tightening. "Got it. We'll lock everything down." Chase exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. He had expected retaliation, but the fact that Mills had made a direct threat against his daughters, that was a mistake. Because now, Chase wasn't just a businessman fighting to protect his company. He was a father fighting for his family, and he was prepared to go to war. Breakfast and broken walls. "Did you burn them?" Rose's voice broke through Chase's haze as he flipped a pancake in the kitchen. He turned, arching an eyebrow at her where she sat at the counter, arms crossed skeptically. Lisa sat beside her, swinging her legs as she eagerly watched. "I don't burn pancakes," Chase said. Rose smirked. "I don't know. You seem like the kind of guy who only eats boring protein shakes and bland oatmeal." Lisa giggled. Chase set the plate of golden pancakes in front of them. "Try them, and then tell me." Lisa immediately dug in, her eyes going wide after the first bite. "This is amazing." Chase tried to ignore how much those 3 words made his chest warm. Rose, still cautious, took a bite, and then tried to act unimpressed. "It's decent," she said. Chase smirked. "I'll take that." The 3 of them sat in an unusual but comfortable silence. For once, the tension between them wasn't so thick. The girls weren't looking at him with distrust. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. Halfway through breakfast, Lisa suddenly spoke. "Did you know?" she asked, her voice small. "Did you know we were out there all this time?" The question hit Chase like a sledgehammer. He put his fork down. "No." Lisa studied him for a long moment, her wide blue-gray eyes so much like Sarah's. Rose, however, didn't look convinced. "You didn't wonder?" "Not once." "That maybe Mom didn't leave just because she wanted to." Chase exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay steady. "I was told she left because she didn't want me in her life anymore, that she didn't need me." Lisa frowned. "That's not true." "I know that now." Chase's voice was quiet but firm. "And I know that I failed both of you, even if I didn't know. But I swear to you, I will never let you go through that again." Rose looked down at her plate, her expression unreadable. Lisa, on the other hand, smiled. "Okay." Chase blinked. "Okay." Lisa nodded. "Okay. I believe you." Rose snorted. "You trust too easy, Lisa." Lisa shrugged, biting into another pancake. "Maybe. But he's trying. And I think Mom would have wanted us to give him a chance." Chase's breath caught in his chest. "Sarah." He didn't even realize how much he needed to hear that until now. Rose sighed, finally looking at him. "Fine. But I'm not calling you Dad yet." Chase smirked. "I can live with that." A warning from the shadows. As Chase walked into his office later that afternoon, Emily was already waiting for him, her expression dark. "We have a problem." Chase's entire body went on high alert. "What happened?" Emily handed him a thin, cream-colored envelope. "This was delivered to the front desk this morning. No return address." Chase frowned, taking the envelope and carefully opening it. Inside was a single piece of paper. "You should have let sleeping dogs lie. Now they'll suffer the way she did." Chase's grip on the letter tightened until the paper crumpled in his palm. Mills. This was a direct warning. He lifted his gaze to Emily. "We need to move faster. We're running out of time." Emily nodded. "We have enough evidence to expose Mills, but he's too well connected. If we make a move without backup, he could bury this." Chase exhaled sharply. "Then we get backup. Legal, media, law enforcement. I don't care who we need to bring in." We take him down before he gets the chance to hurt them." Emily hesitated. "Chase." His jaw clenched. "I am not losing them, Emily. Not now." Emily studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Then let's end this. The trap is set." That night, Chase sat in the penthouse study, looking through old documents, evidence of Mill's corruption that Emily had uncovered. But his mind wasn't on the papers. It was on the two girls sleeping just down the hall. His daughters. He had failed them once. He wouldn't fail them again. Just as he was about to close his laptop, his phone buzzed. A new message. "Meet me at the docks. Midnight. Alone, or you'll never see them again." Chase's blood went cold. This wasn't just a warning anymore. It was a declaration of war. And Mills had just made the biggest mistake of his life. A dangerous gambit. The city never truly slept. But on this night, Chase Donovan Carter felt as though the whole world had gone silent. The text on his phone burned in his mind like a brand. "Meet me at the docks. Midnight. Alone, or you'll never see them again." Gregory Mills had made his move. Chase leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight, his fingers tightening around his phone. He wasn't a fool. He knew exactly what this was. A trap. A carefully calculated play designed to make him act on emotion rather than reason. And Mills thought he would walk into it blindly. Chase exhaled sharply, pushing down the storm of rage and fear threatening to consume him. He wouldn't be reckless, but he would be ready. He tapped his phone, calling the one person who could help him navigate this. "The plan is set. That's suicide." Emily Clarkson's voice was sharp, her eyes filled with concern as she stood in Chase's office, arms crossed tightly over her chest. "You can't just go to Mills alone," she continued. "You know exactly what he's capable of." Chase exhaled through his nose. His hands braced on the desk. "I don't have a choice. He's already threatened the twins. If I don't show up, he'll escalate." Emily paced, shaking her head. "I still don't like this." "You're not supposed to," Chase admitted. "But I'm not walking in unprepared." He turned toward Marcus, his head of security, who had been silently watching from the corner of the room. "How many men can you have in place?" Marcus leaned against the wall, his expression unreadable. "4 snipers, 2 in position before you even get there. Another 3 on standby. We'll cover every exit point." Emily didn't look convinced. "And what if Mills still manages to pull something?" "You know he doesn't play by the rules, Chase." Chase's eyes darkened. "Neither do I." There was a dangerous edge to his voice, something he rarely let surface. Mills had stolen too much from him already. He wasn't about to let him take more. Emily sighed, rubbing her temples. "I still think this is insane." Chase smirked humorlessly. "You're not wrong." But there was no other way. Unfinished business. By the time Chase arrived at the docks, the wind had picked up, carrying the salty sting of the ocean. The waves lapped against the wooden pier, the water reflecting the dull glow of the distant city lights. Mills was already waiting. He stood in the shadows near an old warehouse, his expensive coat draped over his shoulders like some kind of self-styled king. Chase approached slowly, his movements precise, measured. "You're punctual," Mills commented, smirking as he took a sip from a flask. "I like that." "Cut the theatrics," Chase said coldly. "What do you want?" Mills chuckled, shaking his head. "Straight to business, just like your father." Chase's jaw tightened. "I am nothing like him." Mills raised an eyebrow. "Aren't you? You built your empire on the foundation of his. You used his wealth, his strategies, his ruthlessness." He took another sip. "But unlike him, you let yourself grow weak." Chase clenched his fists. "Weak?" Mills smiled. "That woman. Those brats. You let them turn you into something soft. Vulnerable." Chase's stomach twisted with rage, but he kept his face unreadable. Mills took a step closer, lowering his voice. "Walk away from this, Chase. Go back to your high-rise. Run your company. Forget about them. Otherwise, he smiled cruelly, they won't make it to see another sunrise. The word sent ice through Chase's veins. But he had expected this. He had planned for this. Chase exhaled slowly. You made one mistake, Mills. Mills raised an eyebrow. Oh, you thought I came here alone. Before Mills could react, a red laser dot appeared on his chest. Then another. Then two more. Mills stiffened, his smirk faltering for the first time. Chase smiled coldly. You see, I learned from my father's mistakes. And the first rule of power is this: never fight alone. Mills' hands curled into fists. You think this scares me? No, Chase admitted. But this might. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a slim USB drive, holding it between two fingers. Mills' expression darkened. What is that? Chase tilted his head. Evidence. Mills went still. Chase smirked. Emily's been very busy. We traced every offshore account, every shell company, every illegal deal you've made in the last 2 decades. And this. He twirled the USB between his fingers. This is enough to bury you. Mills' eyes flickered with something. Fear. Chase took a step closer. You like making people disappear, don't you, Mills? His voice dropped to a whisper. Let's see how you like it when it happens to you. Mills' smirk was gone now. For the first time, he looked unsure. You wouldn't, Mills said, but his voice wasn't as steady as before. Chase leaned in. Try me. The silence stretched between them. Then, Mills exhaled sharply, shaking his head. You think you've won, Carter. He laughed bitterly. This doesn't end here. Chase's smile was ice. No, it ends in prison. For you. At that moment, the sound of approaching sirens split the air. Mills' eyes widened. Chase tucked the USB drive back into his pocket. I called in a favor. Mills' hands clenched at his sides. You bastard. Chase smirked. Takes one to know one. The police cars screeched to a stop near the docks. Officers spilled out, weapons drawn. Mills turned, his expression finally slipping into something close to panic. You'll regret this, Carter, he spat. Chase didn't blink. No, you will. As the officers moved in, Mills let out a sharp breath. And then, just like that, the man who had spent years controlling people's lives was dragged away in handcuffs. The aftermath. By the time Chase returned to the penthouse, the adrenaline was wearing off. He had won. Mills was finished. But the real battle was only beginning. As he stepped inside, he found Rose and Lisa sitting on the couch, watching the late-night news. His face was on the screen. So was Mills. The words "Heartwarming" and "Scandal" flashed across the bottom. Chase sighed. Lisa was the first to look at him. Did you do it? She asked quietly. Chase nodded. Mills is gone. Lisa exhaled in relief. Rose, however, just studied him carefully. And now what? Chase hesitated. Now we move forward. We rebuild. Rose frowned. As what? Chase met her gaze. As a family. Rose was silent for a long moment. Then, finally, softly, she nodded. Okay. Chase's chest tightened. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And for the first time in 12 years, he had something worth fighting for. Something real. Something that no one, not even Gregory Mills, could ever take away from him again. Rebuilding from the ashes, the city had changed overnight. For the past week, the headlines had been relentless. Every major news outlet was plastered with Carter Empire, exposes, DCADs of CORUPTYN. Gregory Mills behind bars. The scandal had sent shockwaves through Wall Street, shaken the boardrooms of Carter Enterprises, and had effectively dismantled the remnants of his father's old empire. Chase Donovan Carter had won. But at what cost? He stood in his penthouse, staring at the city skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows, feeling something he hadn't felt in years: uncertainty. The war was over. Mills was finished. The corrupt legacy his father had left behind was being systematically burned to the ground. But now, Chase was left standing among the ashes, wondering what came next. For the first time in years, he wasn't strategizing the next hostile takeover. He wasn't drowning in corporate meetings or manipulating markets. He was a father, and he had no idea how to be one. A new beginning. Rose, that's cheating. Lisa's voice rang through the penthouse, breaking Chase's thoughts. He turned to see the twins sitting cross-legged on the floor, engaged in a heated battle of chess. Rose smirked. "No, it's strategy. You should try it sometime, Lisa." Lisa huffed, crossing her arms. "You can't just move the queen like that." "I can if I distract you long enough to do it," Rose shot back. Chase shook his head with amusement as he approached. "What's the score?" "Lisa's losing," Rose answered immediately. Lisa groaned. "It's not over yet." Chase chuckled, sitting down across from them. "Mind if I play the winner?" Both girls froze. For a moment, Chase thought he had overstepped, that they weren't ready. But then Lisa grinned. "Sure, you can lose next." Rose snorted. "Please, he's probably never played chess in his life." Chase smirked. "Try me." The past still lingers. Later that evening, Chase found himself sitting across from Emily in his office, sifting through the last of the documents from the Mills investigation. "Are you really stepping down as CEO?" Emily asked, watching him carefully. Chase exhaled. "I don't know yet." She frowned. "Carter Enterprises is your life." "No," Chase corrected. "It was my life." "There's a difference." Emily studied him for a moment before nodding. "Then what's next?" Chase leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "I want to fix what my father broke. I want to make Carter Enterprises into something better. But," he hesitated, "I also want to be there for the twins. I don't want them to feel like an afterthought to my career." Emily softened. "You already changed more than you realize, Chase." Chase looked at her, skeptical. "How do you figure?" Emily smirked. "For starters, the old Chase Carter wouldn't have spent his morning making pancakes." Chase groaned. "They'll never let that go, will they?" Emily chuckled. "Nope." For the first time, Chase didn't mind. A ghost from the past. Just as Chase was about to close the last of the folders, his phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. His stomach tightened. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Carter." A beat of silence. Then, a voice he never expected to hear again. "You shouldn't have done this, Chase." Chase's breath left him in a rush. He knew that voice. It was Marcus Wheeler, his father's former lawyer. The man who had handled most of his father's personal business behind closed doors. The man who had vanished after his father's death. Chase's grip on the phone tightened. "Where the hell have you been, Wheeler?" Wheeler sighed. "Someplace safer than where you are now." Chase's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" "You think Mills was the end of it." Wheeler chuckled darkly. "Mills was just a soldier in a much bigger army. And now that you've exposed him, the people above him aren't happy." Chase's blood ran cold. "Who?" "You already know who." Chase exhaled sharply. "The old guard. My father's other partners." Bingo. Chase pinched the bridge of his nose. He should have known. His father had never been a solo operator. His empire had been built on a web of alliances, powerful men who thrived in the shadows. And now that Chase had burned their network to the ground, they were coming for him. "You have two choices, Chase," Wheeler continued. "Walk away, let them rebuild what you tore down, or get ready for a much bigger fight." Chase's jaw clenched. "Let them come." Wheeler sighed. "I figured you'd say that." Then, just before the line disconnected, Wheeler spoke one last time. "Keep your daughters close, Chase. They won't stop with just you." The line went dead. Chase sat in silence, his pulse hammering in his ears. The war wasn't over. It had just begun. A father's promise. That night, Chase sat on the penthouse balcony, staring out over the city, lost in thought. He had started this fight thinking he was just dismantling his father's corruption. But now he knew better. This wasn't just about business. It was about power, about control. And the people his father had once worked with weren't going to let it go easily. Chase's fingers tightened around the edge of the balcony. For the first time in his life, he wasn't fighting for profits. He was fighting for his daughters. And there was nothing he wouldn't do to protect them. Chase. He turned. Lisa stood in the doorway, rubbing her eyes sleepily. Chase immediately softened. "Hey, kiddo. Can't sleep." Lisa hesitated before stepping onto the balcony, hugging herself against the night breeze. Just thinking. Chase crouched down so they were eye level. About what? Lisa looked at him, her eyes filled with something raw and vulnerable. Are we safe now? Chase's heart clenched. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to tell her everything was over, that she never had to be afraid again. But he had never lied to them before. He wasn't going to start now. Instead, he reached out, gently brushing a stray hair from her face. "Not yet," he admitted. "But we will be. I promise you that." Lisa searched his face for a long moment. Then, without warning, she stepped forward and hugged him. Chase stiffened for half a second before wrapping his arms around her tightly. It wasn't just a hug. It was trust. Lisa pulled back after a moment, wiping her eyes quickly. "Okay." Then, just as she turned to go back inside, she smirked. "And don't forget, you still owe me a chess rematch." Chase chuckled, shaking his head. "Deal." As Lisa disappeared into the penthouse, Chase exhaled, turning his gaze back to the city. He didn't know what was coming next, but whatever it was, he was ready. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't just Chase Carter, billionaire businessman. He was a father. And no one, not his father's enemies, not the remnants of the old empire, was going to take that from him. Not without a fight.